ridiculous. I want to say it now, but I can't because we got a couple hundred more notes before we get to it. But the idea is, if you think it's powerful, and if you do agree with the fact that Nietzsche says that the sophist is really in a position of power, then you have no idea what the will to power is when the sophist recognizes and acknowledges the Dionysian. That's really scary, right? And I know for a fact that I've never, because I scour the internet before I start doing these videos. No one's discussed it before, right? No one's discussed it before. So when we get there, it'll be a treat. Top of page 74, number 3. So we've discussed 2 through 2c. Plato's forms. This is very, very important, right? Plato's forms as an antithetical force to Hellenic sophistry and the flexibility inherent in its system. Now, I've done a lecture series, maybe an hour or two, on Plato's hierarchy of the forms, where I talk about the hierarchical conceptual progression from conjecture to absolute knowledge in the forms as such. And there's various rungs of conceptual hierarchy that go along with Plato's discussion of the forms. First thing, because I know a lot of ancient scholars watch my videos, I did my master's in antiquity studies. I did my master's on Plato specifically, and I do recognize, just as a caveat, that not all ancient scholars agree with the fact that Plato has this concept named the forms. So the very attempt to try and situate this discourse of forms presupposes that Plato had the discussion of forms. I'm going to acknowledge that and make the presupposition nevertheless, right? So, assuming, and I do wholly recognize that the counterexample that, Jason, you're wrong because Plato doesn't even have forms, has legitimacy, but I can't, for the purpose of the lecture series, defend both stances. It's just too much. So, assuming that Plato has this notion of the forms, which is what contemporarily and sort of pop culturally everybody assumes, except for a very, very select group of very esoteric scholars. Assuming that Plato has this idea of the forms, we know what it is, right? And for those of you who don't know what it is, look it up, you'll have an idea. Forms don't exist in this world, they exist in a world of transcendence. Now, whether or not that world, there's philosophical discourse on the nature of that world. Is that world an existing thing? What are the qualities of that world, what have you? The idea is, Plato, the example that I give in the lecture, is that I show you a picture of my daughter holding a sunflower, and she's smiling, the beautiful yellow flower, my daughter's beautiful, the picture's beautiful. And I ask you, look at the image of my daughter on the photograph, and look at my daughter in the middle of the sunflower field. Which one's more beautiful? And Plato says, obviously the image of my daughter is more real. The conception of beauty has more significance in the real world than it does in the photograph. The photograph is a representation of the actual beauty that exists. He then goes on to say that the existence of my daughter in the field is merely a representation of the form of beauty, which is beauty as such, right? Because my daughter's beautiful, a beautiful horse is beautiful, a beautiful car, a beautiful woman, a beautiful man, beautiful clothes. The thing that governs the concept of beauty as such is the form. Unfortunately, what Plato does is he posits that concept of beauty in a transcendental world. Obviously, Plato comes prior to the biological Jesus Christ as figure, and thus it is absolutely, categorically, undeniably, historically impossible to argue against the fact that Plato and Plato's dialogues influenced Christian theology. That's a fact. That's a fact, right? So we recognize that Christian, and this is Nietzsche now, Christian theology informs its theological discourse from the Platonic separation between the world of existence and the world of the forms. Obviously, in Christian theology, Nietzsche argues that we substitute the world of the forms with heaven and God and the angels and the good guys, and the world of existence with this world. And this world is a world of sin from the fallen. I spoke in previous lectures about Adam's role and Eve's role, and that what the apple represent was actually the first free act in the Christian cosmological universe. Right? Every act prior to that was not a free act. It was an act that was part of, if you will, the grand design. Eve's disobedience was the actual first free act of any human being, but that act was an act of disobedience, and hence everything in this world, according to the Christian liturgical theology, is one of crap. It's all fallen. It's all evil. Now, Nietzsche says, and this is important, well, this is me, and then I'll quote a little bit of Nietzsche at the end. So this is me. The philosopher, unlike the Hellenic sophist, so the philosopher, unlike the Hellenic sophist, became the strong arm of the establishment. Right? It was the role of the philosopher to impose. What ends up happening is that we see the form now becomes the norm. Right? So this is sort of cliche. The form becomes the norm. So here's the philosopher, here's culture A, here's culture B, and instead of being a sophist and serving as a facilitator between these cultures, right, so that you have the sophist situated, theoretically speaking, conceptually speaking, in between culture A and culture B, and the advantage that the sophist has is the flexibility. The philosopher, via Plato, argues Nietzsche, which is, and this is just so freaking brilliant, right? The philosopher argues Nietzsche isn't flexible anymore, because now there's an absolute truth, right? There's an absolute truth, the world of transcendence, the world of the forms. There isn't this sense in which we can talk about relative beauty. Already we recognize, one, that the discussion of relative beauty misunderstands the notion of relativity, because relativity for the sophist doesn't mean sort of this happenstance. It means relative with respect to me. The philosopher then says, the norm is such. So the forms become the norm. And rather than serving as a facilitator, the philosopher becomes an indoctrinator. So they impose form. Listen, culture A, you should be doing, right? Should. Right? The philosopher becomes, as he says in different texts, right? Unfortunately, this conception of the philosopher becomes the dragon, the thou shalt, the person who gives commands. I know what is right, because I am the one who has access to the forms. I read the Republic, and I'm the philosopher king. And the philosopher king has access to the knowledge of the forms. The philosopher king is the one who indoctrinates with the discourse on metals, right? The role of the bronze, the role of the gold, right? The philosopher king is the one who has access. Now, Nietzsche says the Christian church recognizes the power of this narrative. Now, you don't. My point isn't to. I'm not as hardcore as Nietzsche with respect to just castigating Christianity. I'm not. I really am not. It is important, however, to see the undeniable overlap. It's not like Plato came after Christianity. Plato came before Christianity. Now, Christianity adopts the notion of transcendence in terms of transposing form with heaven. Christianity adopts the role, as Nietzsche says, of the sacerdotal class, the priestly class, because there's a transposition between the philosopher and the priest. The philosopher has access to the forms because of knowledge. The priest has access to God because of piety. The philosopher is put in a position to rule over those who are hierarchically beneath them. You can even go Indian caste system, right? The Brahmin and the untouchable. The philosopher king and the merchant class, right? This narrative, and this is why I love Joseph Campbell so much, this narrative isn't unique to just Greece. We find this narrative throughout almost all the populations in the world. And, you know, maybe one day when I find the time I might do a lecture series on Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces. But this is if I don't believe in human nature at all. I categorically deny the belief in human nature. But if there is this thing called human nature, then Joseph Campbell wrote the book on it, because it's the way we tell stories. The one thing that is common to us all is the fact that, wow, do you think it's coincidental that the narrative that Plato described in his dialogues was transposed into the narrative that the Christian church created its theological discourse? No, it isn't coincidental.